In the last movie, we learned how to execute our first PHP script, but we didn't really talk about what it means. So in this movie, we're actually going to break it down and start to understand a little bit of the way PHP works. So let's start by looking at the command that we just typed and executed. There are three parts here. There's the $PHP, then there's a space before we get to the next part, which is PHP info, parentheses, and then semicolon. There's a space and the greater than. I want to look at the first and third parts of that, which are the tags that tell it to begin and end PHP commands. We talked about in the introduction that PHP can be embedded in HTML, and this is the mechanism that makes that happen. When our server accesses the web page, it knows to be ready for PHP because we have the .php extension, but it still needs some indication of where HTML starts and stops and where PHP starts and stops. And we do that by telling it, okay, turn on PHP. And we do that with the $PHP. Start filtering with your PHP filter. And when we're done with all of our PHP commands, we put ? and the greater than side. So you'll hear me often refer to these as start PHP, open PHP, or an open PHP tag. I might just call it the PHP tag. That's what I'm talking about when I say this, and you'll get used to it, and it'll become really commonplace for you. Now, there are some variations on this that you should also be aware of. There are the short open tags, and this is considered bad form. And in PHP 3 and before that, it was very common to see these, and that's to exclude the PHP from it. And you might even have an equal sign immediately after the ? But this just says turn on PHP, turn off PHP. Most of the time, this will still work for you, but it's considered bad practice. And you really want to always go ahead and say, what I mean here is PHP, by specifically writing those letters, PHP, after the first ? You have the option of telling your web server whether or not to allow these, and you can see whether that's set in that PHP info that we looked at, and changing it in your php.ini file. There's another type of tag, which are the ASP style tags. And if you're familiar with active server pages that Microsoft has, you'll be familiar with these tags because that's how ASP tells its web server to embed ASP into HTML code. And that's done with the % instead of the ? You can use ASP-style tags, but you have to enable them in the php.ini file. This is considered very bad form, and there's a really good reason why this is bad form, and that's because it doesn't always work. Obviously, if you write a PHP file and you use these kind of tags, and I take your code and I put it on my server, and my server doesn't allow the use of these kinds of tags, then suddenly your code won't work and it won't process. So we want to stick with these standard tags where we open the PHP using the letters PHP and close it the same way. So now you can understand what was actually happening in my file. I told it, start looking for PHP code. Then I issued a PHP code command, a very special and complex one, followed by stop looking for PHP code. Now, one important thing to know right off the bat is that white space, besides having a single space here to let it know where one command starts and stops, is not significant in PHP. So we can actually put in all sorts of tabs, spaces, line returns, and it won't make any difference at all. What's important to the parser is where does the PHP start and where does it stop? And PHP itself is not picky about what white space comes in there. As long as it's able to separate one command from another, it doesn't care if you have extra white space. And when we say white space, we're talking about spaces, carriage returns, tabs, the things that show up as being invisible when we're looking at our text editor. So one good thing is that we can actually use that white space to our advantage to write very readable code. And we can go ahead and put tabs, spaces, returns in whatever way makes our code readable to us. So there's one last thing I want to show you before we move on. I'm going to save this document, and I'm going to create a new file. So we're just going to write some basic HTML here. I'm going to put in my open HTML tag. I'm going to have my head tag with a title tag inside, and I'm just going to put basic in there for now, and close the title tag. I'm going to put another head tag, open the body tag. We'll just put in basic for the body as well, and close the body tag and close the HTML. Now, Now, I think it's really useful to go ahead and develop a very basic HTML page like this so that we don't have to keep typing it all the time. Because otherwise, every time we want to create a basic page and embed PHP into it, we're going to have to retype all of that. So I'm going to go ahead and save that file by going to File and Save, and I'm going to call it simply basic.html. Now, this is an HTML file. It's not a PHP file. I'm going to hit Save. And we can actually load that up in our browser the same way. I'll go back to Firefox, and instead of asking for phpinfo.php, I'm going to ask for basic.html. And you'll see that it gave me that basic HTML page. Now, if we switch back to our basic page, and we go ahead and if instead of putting in basic, if I put PHP code in there, the same PHP code that we just used, php info, and I'll put a semicolon after it, I'll save that, and we go back to our browser, and we'll load it up. Hit reload right here. You'll see that it didn't come up with anything for us. And in fact, if we view the source for this page, it went ahead and just put it in as text. Now, if you were astute, you probably noticed the reason why that happened, and it's because the file is called .html, not .php. So even though we have the starting and ending PHP tags in there, that would normally tell the server, look, here's some PHP code, because we didn't call the file .php, it wasn't looking for it. It wasn't on the lookout. So we have to have the combination of both. We have to both have the file called .php to alert it that there may be PHP coming, and we have to have the start and ending tags. Let's go ahead and turn our basic file back into just simply a basic file that we can save. And we're going to set that aside so that we can reuse it. And in fact, we're going to reuse it in the very next movie as we start working with the very first PHP functions.